Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate the time. So my name is Graham Krizek. I am founder and CEO of Voltage. And to give a really quick rundown on Voltage, I'm sure most people here already know a decent amount about us, but we are a Bitcoin and Lightning infrastructure provider. So what that means is we provide services and tools to help you use the Bitcoin and Lightning network, easier, faster, and more reliably than, by doing it all yourself, essentially. So we provide Lightning Network node hosting, Bitcoin node hosting. We're working on some observability tools, liquidity tools. We're really trying to make the experience of building and using Bitcoin and the Lightning Network easier than doing it all yourself, which is pretty much how most people have done it up until now. So this seminar today is going to be specifically focused on Lightning Network security. And so we're going to go through several of the important things to know about security inside of the Lightning Network, both from kind of the ways that you can harden your node, or ways that, just best practices and things like that. So with that, we can go in through the agenda. So or I guess right off the bat, we're going to talk about what is security and why does it matter in the context of Lightning. And then we're going to go into some of those best practices and really kind of dive into all of the different areas that you really need to focus on when you're running your Lightning node. And then we'll also, once we kind of talk through what are these best practices, we're going to kind of talk through some of the ways to implement them. How do you actually take this information that I'm just going to kind of talk about, and then how do you actually apply it to the node that you're using? I'm going to go through some examples of both doing it yourself if you were running outside of Voltage, so just kind of general node running options, and then also focusing on what does Voltage do to help you when you're doing these best practices and trying to implement them yourselves. And of course, at the end we will have Q&A, so be sure to I think that you can drop your questions in as we go, but we'll obviously have time at the end for any questions, so we'll make sure that we get all of those answered as well. So diving in, so we're going to first touch on what is security, like I said. Security in the Lightning Network is general cybersecurity at the end of the day. And so what is cybersecurity? It's the practice of securing your technology, processes, and your systems and to prevent from unwanted access or intrusion or stealing of files or funds or anything like that. So I think most people are pretty well versed in what is cybersecurity. And so when we think about how does that apply to Lightning? I mean, first and foremost, it's keeping funds safe. That's what's unique about the Lightning Network and Bitcoin in general, is that these servers that you're running, or these nodes or whatever, they're not just keeping your personal records safe. It's not just your social security number or your Amazon login. It's literally your money. And what's also different about when you're running your Lightning node is say you get your credit card stolen, you can call your bank and cancel the credit card or whatever, refute the transactions that they did. In Bitcoin and Lightning, or just crypto broadly, even if your funds are stolen, they're basically gone. There's no one you can call to ask to get that transaction reversed. Maybe it's in Ethereum, you can, I don't know, but inside of Bitcoin and Lightning, you really you need to keep your funds safe, because once they're gone, they're essentially gone. So that is adding it makes it a very important thing to focus on security when you're using the Lightning Network and Bitcoin in general, because this is ultimately your money on your computer or your node, and so we need to really focus on keeping that safe. So some of the reasons, like I mentioned, securing your own funds is the big obvious one, right? But then also there's some other additional things that are important when you're thinking about securing your Lightning node. Another one is being a good channel partner. So what if you had a channel open to a node in the network and it got hacked, and it's either maybe force closing channels with you, or it's doing weird stuff for doing channel jamming against you, or it can really it can go bad in a lot of different ways. So as part of being a good channel partner on the network, you really need to make sure that you are running your nodes securely, because it can have adverse effects not only on your own funds but on the greater network or your channel partners. And then if you're running your business on top of Lightning, obviously protecting your users, outside of just, if they're stealing funds from your node, that's potentially your users' funds as well. But also being able to protect their information, their transactions, all of the things that all of your user data that you have inside of your node is also very important to protect as well. And then finally, avoiding the headache. Like if anyone has gone through a cybersecurity incident and detection, remediation, the whole process, it's one of the worst things that you could go through in the kind of the IT world. It's just huge headache, a lot of stress. It's not fun. And so above all else, like, if just securing your funds wasn't enough, it's just a big pain in the butt to get hacked and have to deal with it. So when we think about where we are today, I think that memes are the best way to really communicate value. And this is a good favorite meme of mine where it says, "I don't know how to secure my node, and at this point, I'm too afraid to ask." And I think that that is too much of the Lightning Network today, where everyone is just quickly spinning up nodes and they're adding funds to it, which is great. We're growing the network, but I think that people are just kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and they aren't really quite understanding what are the steps that you need to take to make sure that you are actually securing your node and keeping your funds safe. And so this is something that I don't want to go on for too long. I want to make sure that we are communicating the ways to effectively secure your node. And so we can do that today, and then continue this conversation going forward to make sure that all node runners out there are securing their funds in a good way. So one of the great things as I go through these best practices is this existing cybersecurity practices apply. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel necessarily, and that we're not creating brand new processes or tools or systems to solve this. At the end of the day, these nodes are servers that are running a set of software that has APIs and all of these things that exist in other parts of the IT ecosystem. And so we aren't really reinventing the wheel. There's some nuances, obviously, about the ways that nodes operate and the funds and all of those things. But generally speaking, a lot of the same practices apply to just general cybersecurity in general. So that's a really good thing, that we don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. So with that, we're going to dive into some of these best practices. So how do what are the ways to actually secure your node? And there's some kind of larger categories that we're going to go through that we will use, and then kind of like dive deep into them. So the first one is the credentials. And so credentials are obviously the things that control your node in a couple different ways, which we're going to go into. And so securing your credentials is probably one of the biggest parts of securing your node. So when we think about credentials, I kind of call out three types of credentials here. Your seed phrase, which is essentially the private key to your Lightning node, which controls, depending on the implementation and how it's set up and all of those things, it controls your funds and your channels like on the node. So it is the root private key of your node. And so this is something that is very important to keep safe, just like I think that we're all pretty used to if you're doing on-chain Bitcoin. When you're generating your seed phrase, that's something that you keep very, very secure. You back it up in multiple places. You get a steel plate and like hammer it into the steel plate, like all of those things. And those same methods still exist in Lightning, where your seed phrase is still that private key that is like kind of the root of almost all of your funds inside of your node. So it's something that obviously needs to be kept very secure. Your node password, generally speaking, is again, I'm keeping this sort of implementation agnostic. So I'm kind of saying things that apply to both LND, Core Lightning, Eclair, all these different things. They each have their own nuances into the some of the ways that they interact. But generally speaking, your node password is the thing that that encrypts the database and a lot of the sensitive information. And so this is something that's generally used like at startup. And then finally, API keys. Each implementation does API keys a little bit differently. Like LND, they're Macaroons. Core Lightning has the main communication is like a file socket, but they also have things like runes in some cases. I cannot remember what the Eclair API access method is, but essentially this is the thing that is used to control the node, to open up channels, to send funds, whatever. And so describing each one a little bit more in depth. So your seed phrase, like I said, very, very important. This is something that should only be accessed by the admin, like kind of the most senior person in your organization or your operations or whatever. needs to be backed up several places, needs to be kept very secure, and it should not be accessed by anyone that isn't, I guess, trustworthy with like having complete access to all of the funds. And additionally, this is something that is very static. Once your seed phrase for your node is something that is created and it never changes. The only time that your seed phrase changes is if you're creating a new node or a separate node or something like that. So your seed phrase is very static for the node. Your node password is used to encrypt the node's data. This is also something that should be kept very secure and backed up in multiple places. This is also something that only like a very senior admin level person should have access to. There's ways that you can keep this really secure. Okay, before I get there, I guess the node password is generally used every time like a node is restarted. So it's when the node is first starting up, someone needs to enter in the password to decrypt the data, the private keys, whatever information that it needs into the node's process, and so it can like use that when it's referencing it for channel opens or transaction sending or anything like that. So your node's password is something that is semi-static. You can change your node's password later on, but generally speaking, you aren't changing your password like every day or something. You might have a good like password rotation policy where it changes maybe every month or something like that, but it's semi-static in that it doesn't change often, but it can change it whenever the interval that you want it to. And then ultimately, it is encrypting a lot of the sensitive information inside of your node. So only admins should access it. And then to help with, for those that are kind of in the DevOps world, you can imagine where, say you are running, a large business and you have like your node gets restarted, maybe it's an update. And then, if you have to go and like call your CEO or your manager or something to come and unlock the node, especially in like a kind of a disaster recovery scenario, that's not a great experience to have. And so there's ways that you can kind of implement automatic unlocking inside of LND. And so you could do things like every time the node is started up and it's waiting to be unlocked, you can like call to an external API that maybe has that password in some super lockdown environment, and then it responds and unlocks. Or you can have some tight security controls on the server and have it inside of the server. There's a couple of different ways to handle this, but ultimately, password needs to be secured, and it needs to be accessed fairly infrequently. Every time your node restarts, it needs to be accessed, but then otherwise it can kind of go away, be in a secure spot. And then finally, API keys. So like I said, this controls the node. So this is something that is actually the thing that you use when you want to send funds, open channels, essentially operate the node itself. Like I mentioned, there's several different types of these. There's Macaroons, there's runes, there's some other, like Sensei, I think just has some kind of standard like API key. So this can be essentially anything, but these have much more flexibility in what they're able to do. And so you can bake by default, like when you start up LND, it like makes a macaroon that's admin, so it can kind of control everything. But then you're actually able to generate API keys that do specific things. Like you could have one that is read only, so you only have access to view like the information inside of the node, but never actually move money. You can have ones that are able to generate invoices, but never like send funds. You can really be very specific, generally speaking, on these macaroons or the API keys, and you can set them to have very specific permissions. So because of that, you're actually able to use these in a much more flexible way, where these could be given to anyone depending on their role and their permissions and what you want. If you want to have like an accounting team, like looking at your node, you can give them a read access macaroon and be able to see things. Or if you need to have like your applications that need to be able to generate invoices or send, you can tighten those macaroons very, very specifically into what they need to do, which is there's a concept in kind of cybersecurity of like principle of least privilege, meaning an application or a person should only have the bare minimum set of permissions that they should need to do their job. And so you don't want to give that accountant the admin macaroon because all they need to do is really view the transactions. They don't have any need to send or receive or something like that. So the API keys allow you to exercise that principle of least access. And so another important point that I have here at the bottom is don't reuse. So I think that that's one of the big problems inside of the Lightning Network today is, people, when they create their LND node, they have this admin macaroon, and then they just use this one admin macaroon everywhere. They use it for Zeus, they use it for Thunder Hub, they use it for like all of these different things. And depending on what you're trying to do, there's situations where that's okay, and there's situations where that's not. Because imagine where if you accidentally publish that macaroon to GitHub or something, and then you have to revoke that macaroon, you have to make a new one. Well, you have to go through every single application that you have been using to reset it, which is a big, lengthy, hard process. And so if you were able to bake a macaroon for each specific application that you want to connect to your node, that is a better scenario, because if your macaroon gets leaked or something like that, you are able to just essentially revoke that one macaroon instead of having to go through every application and redo all of the credentials. So given the flexibility with these API keys, you're really able to do a lot of those more fine-grained permissions and baking and all of those things. To have a little diagram, I'm just kind of demonstrating that there's like these three types, and I kind of outline them up here of like your seed is static, never really changes. You never need it besides when you're doing creating your node, and then if you ever need to do some type of recovery or backup or something like that, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. Your password is semi-static, that it doesn't change a lot, but it can change as often as you want it to be. But there's only one for the node. And then the API keys are finally, they're dynamic. You can create as many as you want. You can really get fine-grained with the permissions on them. And then also to kind of demonstrate even more of that flexibility that you can do with these API keys in general, it depends on the node implementation and what's possible, but you can do a lot of very complex rules inside of them as well. Like you could set a rules engine that says if it's Tuesday and the amount that I'm sending is less than 1,000 Satoshis, allow it to go through, but deny everything else. And so you can get very specific into what you want these macaroons to do. Some of that is possible inside of the macaroon itself. You can bake it with like IP restrictions, but then there's also things inside of like LND that does like a RPC middleware, which essentially lets you hook up your custom application to do well-defined logic to enforce policies like this. So you can get even more fine-grained than just the permissions of send or receive, but you could set custom logic around like days of the week or the amount or anything like that. So you can get very, very specific on your rules engine inside of your node. And it depends on, maybe this is overkill if you're just running a node yourself and you're the only one that's accessing it. You can imagine if you're doing a production deployment, creating a wallet software or something, this could be very robust and very beneficial for you to implement. And so just depends on where you are in the stack and what you're creating. But these advanced rules can be very, very helpful. So going into the next phase is communication. So what this means is more of kind of how do you communicate with the node, and how does your node communicate with a greater network? So there's sort of two types of communications that nodes do. One is peer-to-peer. So that is the communication from your node into the greater Lightning Network, communicating with its channel partners, with the gossip network, all of those things. And then there's also the API request. So that is you or the software or whatever is trying to send requests into the node to actually control like what it does of opening channels, or etc. And so going into each one, so the peer-to-peer network is, like I said, communication with a greater network. It is communicating with all of those other nodes out there. This is very likely to have your peer-to-peer connection open to the entire internet. It's possible to do things that are more locked down, where if you take an example of like Cash App, I think that their peer-to-peer network is locked. Their peer-to-peer port on like their nodes are locked down, so they only allow connections from specific parties. It's a very, very, very secure way of doing it. But generally speaking, a lot of nodes out there want it just open to the entire internet, because then you can open up channels into any node on the network. You can accept node channels from any node on the network. You can kind of just participate in this peer-to-peer network more easily and more freely. And then all like packets sent across this peer-to-peer network is encrypted to your pub key. So this isn't just kind of plain text communication in the peer-to-peer network. Everything is it's raw TCP, but it's all encrypted. So there's not nothing. No one could see what is being sent or communicated to your node only you can, because all packets are encrypted to your pub key, which is your identifier on the network. And getting into API requests, so this is you, the user, communicating to your node. This should never be open to the public internet. This is just like I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's escaping. But this should never be open to the internet, and that you should be the only one that is able to actually issue requests into your node. And even if obviously you have to be authenticated to the API via the Macaroon or something like that. But even then, even requiring the credential to issue commands, that's not enough to safeguard against abuse or attacks if you have your APIs exposed to the internet. And that what if there is an exploit that comes out where like Macaroons can be invalidated, or you can bypass Macaroon authentication or something. If your node's API is open to the internet, you're susceptible to that attack. And then additionally, just things like DDoS or like people just hammering your API just to give you a hard time is also possible too. So for those reasons, this should be very tightly controlled, and you should only have kind of one clear path into communicating with your node's API. It's also encrypted via TLS to the node. So these are generally like HTTP type APIs. So I have here, there's the common ones are gRPC and REST APIs. So with that, communication is still encrypted to your node using kind of the normal HTTP methods that we experience across the internet or other APIs generally. And then also you can issue tighter controls around RPCs. So you could also lock down using some sort of like reverse proxy or something. You could tighten like RPC endpoints very specifically into what you want to allow access from where. So generally speaking, if we think about it from this diagram, the Lightning Network is through the peer-to-peer port on your node. This is open to the entire internet, and that's fine for the most part. And then your API is strictly from you or your applications, and that communicating to the node to issue commands, and that should be locked down. This should not be open to the internet. Peer-to-peer is open to the internet. So these are the two. These get confused a lot when we talk with users. I think it's a little maybe out of the normal flow of things to have kind of two methods of communication. But this is the way that it functions inside of the Lightning Network. And so going into the next phase is keys and backups. So your node has keys in it, which is like the private keys of the node, and that is derived from that seed phrase, like I was mentioning earlier. And so every node has private keys in it. Depending on the node implementation, it could have both an on-chain wallet and a Lightning wallet. There's some like Eclair doesn't have an on-chain wallet inside of it. It uses like a Bitcoin D like wallet to manage the on-chain funds. But essentially, these private keys are what control the on-chain funds if they have it, and then the Lightning channels and the private keys for those channels as well. So they're obviously very important. They're derived from the seed, like I mentioned, and then these are what control all like the funds and also the channel states. So I'm not going to get super into like how Lightning functions in this webinar, but the channel states are essentially the state of the channel that can be used to like broadcast. If you're trying to close or force close or penalize someone. And so the states are essentially they're the important piece of your channel that you need to access your funds. And so all of that is derived or encrypted via your private keys. And so this is why essentially that seed phrase is very, very important, because it's like the ultimate key to your funds. And then backups are also incredibly important. So this varies between implementations fairly widely. And I'm going to talk about LND specifically for the most part on this one, where in the Lightning Network, keeping those channel states, like I mentioned, is very, very important, because that is essentially what gives you access to your funds. And the backup technology varies across the implementations, where LND has implemented something called SCB, or static channel backups. And this is essentially kind of keeping a copy of the channel states in an encrypted format, like on disk. And so this allows you, if your database gets corrupted or something like that, you can use this as a way to go and recover your funds inside of Lightning. SCB, if you need to do an SCB recovery, the only thing that it is able to do is just force close all of the channels that you have. And so it's a very kind of last resort way of recovering. in that, if your database gets corrupted, your only option is to do an SCB recovery, and that force closes all of your channels. And this is not a perfect solution, but it's a functioning one, I would say. And then for other implementations, there's just the kind of the general idea on just keeping good backups is just backing up your database really, really well. So in Core Lightning, they have like Postgres support or SQLite support. And the methods of keeping good backups there is just to literally back up the database. So kind of doing normal Postgres replication or normal kind of just backups of the database itself. And so if your database ever gets corrupted, you have this this backup DB that you can use to like recover your channel states or something like that. And so that is, if you have good database backups, that would then require you not to force close all of your channels and just recover using the database backup that you have. I will say though that channel states are updated very, very frequently, and if you have just one, I guess depending on how busy your node is, but generally very frequently. And if you have just one, if a channel state is old and you try and use it, you are opening yourself up to a justice transaction, which essentially means your channel partner can steal all of your funds. And so the main takeaway here is to if you're running LND, make a good copy of your SCB, which I'll get into the implementation kind of details later. But SCB is the correct way to do LND backups. For Postgres or Core Lightning is to keep good backups of your database to make sure that you have all of those old channel states. And then Eclair, I'm not 100% sure on like the best way to do it, but I think that they have Postgres support as well. So I'd imagine that it's very similar to Core Lightning. So then getting into monitoring. So this is the other part of running a node is you need to monitor everything. Really, you need to monitor your channels, your peers, your balances. So if there is some sort of cybersecurity incident where someone is, maybe it's not that they just straight up drain all of your funds and steal and take away from it. They're doing something more methodical or trying to kind of be sneaky about it. And so being able to monitor your channels, your balances, uptime, and all these things is very, very important. So you can detect abnormalities. And also being able to monitor things like API requests and command history, who is doing what and who's issuing what commands where, and all of those types of things. And then ultimately alerting about these issues and abnormalities. So you can't have a good cybersecurity practice without knowing when a cybersecurity incident happened. And so this is a very important part of keeping a secure node, is being able to audit and monitor what is happening inside of your node. So I feel like this is another kind of overlooked area inside of Lightning where things like ThunderHub and whatever those kind of like node application managers are good. They get the job done, so to speak, but they're very point in time. And so you don't really know what was your channel balance yesterday compared to today, and how did those funds move? And you kind of have to just rely on your memory, which is, as we all know, is not gonna work long term. And so monitoring is a very, very important aspect of actually running a secure node. And so let's get into the execution bits of this. So actually putting these things into practice so that we can all use them when we're running our nodes. So focusing first on running your own nodes. So these are nodes outside of Voltage. These could be an Umbrel, a Start9. This could just be an LND on your own Linux server. Whatever it is, these are nodes outside of Voltage. So touching on credentials. So you should back up everything somewhere outside of your node. So when we talk about the seed phrase and the your macaroon and your password, all of those should be taken off of the Raspberry Pi or whatever, and they should be stored somewhere else as a point of redundancy. Because if you spill a jug of water on your Raspberry Pi, you're not going to be able to recover those. So it's important to keep all those backed up outside of your node, and then always generate macaroons via CLI or additional tools like ThunderHub has a good like macaroon baking system, and so. You always need to be doing what I was mentioning earlier on creating macaroons for specific applications. And so you can do that if it's like LND, you can use that from the CLI, Core Lightning from the CLI as well, or being able to generate macaroons from inside of the node and then, copying them off into Zeus or whatever it is the best way to do it. So making sure you're exporting things outside of the node and then generating macaroons, just directly from the node. So the API restrictions. So when you're running an API or a Lightning node on like a Raspberry Pi or something at home, you generally use Tor for the API. As we know, Tor is not perfect. It has its own like reliability issues for one, but then it's also it's still, I would call it like still semi-open to the internet, and that if anyone was able to find your Tor like URL, like they could still issue commands to the node, and so it's more secure than just like poking holes in your firewall or something. But if someone were to discover your Tor, your onion address, they would still be able to kind of interact with your API. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's a more obfuscation technique than anything. The alternative is to create holes in your firewall or router. At home, not exactly recommended. Using like opening up ports for like your home internet is probably not great. If you're running on your own server or like AWS or something, this is probably a potential solution. However, you shouldn't, like I said, open it up to the world. You should be very open it up to your home IP or whatever IP it is that you're using to communicate directly to. And then also there's services like Tailscale that are more kind of like, they're more advanced networking tools that do things like proxying and whatnot. I'm not sure of the support of things like Tailscale inside of like Umbrels or those types of services. But I would call those a little bit more advanced, but certainly a possible option when you're communicating with your node. Getting into backups, so copy static channel backups off of your node. This is incredibly important in that there has been, I've heard of many stories of people like losing funds because they have a Raspberry Pi, something happens with the Raspberry Pi, and they didn't have an SCB that they copied off of the node ever. And so it was very hard to do any kind of recovery on it. You should also use separate hard drives, which I think that by now a lot of the at-home node implementations do this, where you kind of separate the OS from like your data directory inside of the Lightning node. So if one drive fails, you have the possibility of not losing everything. And then also redundant power. So if you're running in like an AWS environment or any kind of cloud host, they probably have done redundant power. There's not a lot you can do there anyway. But they do have that already. If you're running at home, I highly recommend using like a UPS, Unified Power System, I think is what the acronym is for, but a UPS to if your power goes out, it has a battery in it, so it can keep running your Raspberry Pi or whatever it is. And so that's the biggest cause of database corruption at home, is losing power, and your database gets corrupted, and then you have to recover via SCB or something else. So generally speaking, use redundant power, and always be sure to copy off SCBs from the node into some other place. This can be automated, but I don't know of any like tool that you could just install to automatically copy SCB off of your node. I think it's something you'd have to like kind of write your own scripts for at home. And then monitoring, frequent checks. So just kind of babysitting it is what I like to call it, of checking in on it frequently. There's some like custom tools like Lightning Labs has a L&D Mon service that kind of uses Prometheus to like watch a node. And then with most of those, there's like just additional things you have to maintain and keep track of. So not only are you like running your node all the time, you have to also run Prometheus and make sure all these applications are up to date and whatnot. So it can get really, really hard. And then things like ThunderHub and whatnot help as well, like I mentioned. But generally speaking, you really kind of gotta either write your own custom tooling or just do a lot of frequent checks to make sure that things are operating the way they should. So now getting into how to apply these things inside of Voltage specifically. So for the credentials, so when you create a node on Voltage, we automatically back up your seeds and your passwords. Well, sorry, we back up your seed, not your password. So you need to make sure to write down your passwords and seeds somewhere else. This is the same as any other service where like if you lose your password inside of Voltage, we give you a bunch of warnings about it. We can't recover your funds. We can't recover your node. Like you really need to be sure to write down your password elsewhere, because everything is encrypted to that password. And so very, very important to write that down and store it elsewhere. Same thing with your seed. Like we do encrypt the seed to the password and upload an encrypted backup. So you kind of have it inside of Voltage, but it's also just really, really good practice to copy your seed somewhere else as well, just so you have it. And so copying seeds and passwords elsewhere, very important. Macaroons, when you first create your node, they're encrypted to that same password, and then they're backed up to our system. So we have just encrypted backups that we cannot access, but it's a backup where as long as you know that password, you're able to then use them. So we do like generate like an invoice, read-only, admin macaroons. But then there's also some methods inside of our dashboard to bake those additional macaroons of invoice macaroons or read-only, like I said. And then we also, we have a ThunderHub integration, so you can easily create a ThunderHub instance. And through ThunderHub is a really pretty nice GUI to be able to bake macaroons for a specific use case, turning on permissions and things like that. And so you should, when you're using we handle a lot of the macaroon stuff inside of things that we host, but if you're trying to connect from elsewhere of like a Zeus or something like that, it's usually recommended to bake your own macaroons and keep track of them for the thing I mentioned earlier of if one gets compromised, you don't have to redo your whole system. And then API restrictions. So our APIs into our nodes are ClearNet supported. So it's just regular IP addresses. So it's just as if you're visiting a website or something like that. So we support ClearNet already. And then we also have the ability to whitelist IP addresses. So this is very, very important in that, like I was mentioning, you don't want your IP open to the entire world. You want to really lock it down to specific people or locations or something like that. And so being able to do IP whitelisting inside of Voltage is very important, where that you can lock your node's API endpoint into specific IP addresses. So you can lock it down to only your home address or the EC2 instance that you're running in AWS or whatever it is. And so you can not have it open to the whole world. There's just a very specific list that you can set to keep your node very, very secure. And this is something that we recommend to all people to make sure that you do set an IP whitelist and make sure that you are able to keep control of your API endpoint and not open it up to the world. We do hear of some people that have some issues of your home IP address maybe not always be the same. Sometimes ISPs switch IP addresses and whatnot. We usually recommend to get some sort of VPN that has like a static IP or at least a block of IPs. Most VPN providers have like a very specific block of IP addresses. And so if you were to use that, then you can add that to the whitelist. And then whenever you want to access your node, connect to the VPN or something. So this enables you to still access your node from anywhere in the world, and then be able to also lock it down where it's not just literally open to the world. But that's what I do for my node is I have my IP whitelist goes to my home address, and I have a VPN inside of my home. And so whenever I'm out, not at home, I just connect to my VPN at home, and then I'm able to send and receive Lightning payments really easily. So this is a good way to lock down your IP address, but still have the accessibility to kind of access it anywhere. Backups are something that we pretty much handle for you. So we automatically copy off the static channel backup files. We have our own system that detects when there's a change to a static channel backup, and then we automatically take it off of the node and upload it into object storage. So we have a copy of it at all times. And you're also able to download that SCB at any time. So through our dashboard, you can do an export and download that SCB whenever you want. And then inside of Voltage, we already use redundant power. So we have all of the power situations handled, I guess. And so backups are pretty well handled inside of Voltage for you. It's not something that you really need to worry about. And you also have that ability to download your SCB at any time. So say if you were, we always people like to talk about the situations where a provider, disappears. And if Voltage disappeared, you could, download, you can make sure that if you have your SCB in your seed phrase, you would be able to access all of your funds. And so this is an important thing to, we handle it from you from the reliability standpoint. And then if you want to have, some extra assurances, you can always download these at any time to have a copy of it for yourself. And then monitoring finally. So this is something that we are going to be working on solving right now with a new product called Surge, which is it's an observability tool for Lightning nodes. So this is a service that really is going to be very, very focused on giving you complete visibility inside of your nodes. So you're able to see all of your transactions, channels, peers, all of the things that you need to know. And it'll be very security focused as well, where we'll be able to add in things like access logs, getting better accounting so you can keep track of funds, so you can see if there's anything going on that might look nefarious. Also alerts of channel closes or offlines or anything that you could really imagine. And so This is something that we are actively developing right now. We hope to launch in like the first week of January or so. Inside of Voltage, we are working on a solution that really gives you complete visibility inside of your node, so you can make sure to optimize for the security posture, not only security, but accounting and all of these other things of just operating your node. And so this, I think, will solve the monitoring aspect of the securing your node very, very well. And so as a final thought here, when in doubt, your gut is right. And that when I kind of taking a nod to what I said at the beginning of the presentation, general cybersecurity practices apply here. So it's the same thing of like, we all know that, hey, don't use the same password on every single website, don't use the same macaron on every single application. And so I think that most people understand how to be secure online, generally speaking. Of course, if you ever have questions, we are more than happy to help you inside of Voltage or outside of Voltage. You can always email support@voltage.cloud, or we have a Discord, voltage.cloud/Discord. We're more than happy to help you. But generally speaking, I want to give everyone that's listening the reassurance of, you all probably have a good gut feeling on what is right when you're securing your node. And so continue on that. And then I hope that these recommendations and walkthroughs were very helpful today as well. So with that, we're going to turn it over to some questions. And I do see we have some questions and comments. So let me go to the questions section first. It is loading. So I'm just going to go, I'll read it off. How do you use someone else's sats in your node? For example, my boss's sats for a new LM project. So that's a good question, and that there's not a great, so like when you think about using, I think that the way that I would describe that is like multi-tenancy inside of a node, which isn't exactly supported by default right now. There's tools like LN-Bits that does a good job of, like, it's an accounting system inside of your node. I think that Lightning Labs is also working on some tooling around kind of doing accounts inside of like Lightning nodes as well. But generally speaking, you usually got to go with like some other tool to manage kind of wallets inside of a node. But then you also kind of got to be careful of like the whole custody aspect of like, now you have custody of your boss's sats in that scenario, and you want to be careful of like kind of separation of duties and all of those things. And so there are things to make it's sort of like a logical separation of wallets, but it's not like the real separation where it's all like under the same seed phrase, if that makes sense. So I hope that answers that question. Going on to the next one. I once had to check security on an internal HTTP server. I found an open source script that took the address and port number and would run a long list of standard tests and return unknown weaknesses. Out of date. Okay, so it's basically like, is there a tool that does kind of penetration testing of a node, or like being able to scan a node and give recommendations on, security best practices? No, there's not anything that does that today. As far as I know, I can't think of anything. That is a very good question, a very good idea on a tool. And so, no, there is not anything that does. I think for like things like out of date, like, out of date software or something like that. Luckily with Voltage, that's something that we generally handle, where we do when there's a new L&D update or something, we publish it to our platform, and then you are able to update whenever, and you can kind of see that there's an update when it's ready. So we handled some of that, but there's not like a tool exactly like what you're saying, which is a very interesting thing that sounds like a good thing to add to Surge potentially, to kind of give you vulnerability alerts or something like that. So the next question, could you explain the difference between macaroons, runes, and classical API keys? Yeah, so that's ultimately they're all like very, very similar. They're a little unique in just kind of the ways that you like implement them and like authenticate with them. Macaroons, they're I'll have to macaroons are something that I think was created at Google, where it's just like it's almost like a cookie like inside of like a website, but it has a little bit more I think capabilities inside of it. But it's essentially they're all essentially API keys. Like the AP, like a classic API key, is usually just like a string of random letters and numbers, and then all of like the validation is handled kind of server side. Where with some of these moons and macaroons and runes, they are able to do a little bit more kind of client side permissions, but they're also always validated against the server. So I think that if you want to really understand the differences between all of those, I would go and kind of research that outside of this. Generally speaking, for Lightning nodes, they're all pretty similar. They get the same job done for the most part. Next question. Are there any compliance requirements to take care of when running nodes you can mention as well? I'm a security architect, and I do not understand compliance is not security, but helps you avoid a lot of legal and other liabilities one can avoid when one is compliant. So are there any compliance requirements to take care of? Not really. Like in that, like there is nothing. There's no like certification or like SOC 2 or something like that for Lightning nodes or anything like that. I think that if you get into like a larger organization, I'm sure a lot of those things apply, and that if there's rules around like access management or credential rotation, all of those things, like generally speaking, apply to Lightning, and you're able to do all of those things inside of your node. But I think to answer your question, there isn't really a specific kind of compliance list or anything like that. I think going back to general cybersecurity practices apply here. And, us at Voltage, we're working on a SOC 2 certification. So we take these things very seriously, and we're working on enhancing the platform and getting a lot of those kind of compliance checks that you generally see from, large tech companies and things like that. So I hope that answers those questions. I'm going to go back to the chat. Because I think that there might have been some questions in here too. Let me do a quick scan. How to control keys as part of a group. So I think Matthias I think it's a similar question to what you're asking earlier about kind of having groupings of sats inside of a node. So again, going back to if you have someone else's sats in your node, like you're kind of custodying those funds, which is maybe that's fine if it's family. If it's something other than that, like for your company, that might be a problem. But I think that generally speaking, the best ways to do that is something with like LN Bits, which is a software that we host in Voltage as well. And that it does that while it's separation kind of segments them. But at the end of the day, all of those sats are on the same node, and there's not really a way to prevent, the node admin from just using all of the sats. So it's kind of a fake separation, like I mentioned earlier. How does force close work if you don't know the latest channel state? So that's what the SCB is essentially the latest channel state, and it just keeps track of that latest channel state. And so that's all that it knows. So you do need to have the latest channel state to force close, if I'm understanding all that right. And that's what the SCB is just a copy of that latest channel state for all of your channels. And so every time there's like a channel update, your SCB file gets updated with that latest channel state. And so it just is kind of the last known good snapshot that it can use. Thank you, Alex, for uninterruptible power supply. That makes more sense. So that's a good call out from Joe. It sounds like there's Balance of Satoshis, which is a pretty popular tool for kind of doing node management. I think that they have a way to do SCB backups into like Telegram or something. Same with ThunderHub. I forgot about that they have a SCB upload service as well. So yes, that's a good call out, that if you're doing things outside of Voltage, Balance of Satoshis or ThunderHub do have good solutions for backing up SCBs. And yes, it is only SCB is generally only a few kilobytes. It's not a whole lot. On LND, it's a password, not a BIP39 passphrase, right? Yeah, like the question is LND, it's a password, not a BIP39 passphrase, which it has both really. Like there's it has like a seed phrase. I don't know if it's BIP39 compliant or not. I think it's like derived from like AEZ or something, but it has a seed phrase, and then it also has a password that is like the thing that is used to encrypt the data. So they're different things. Any way we can throttle privileges to let them do what needs to be done and not have the ability to take all the money and retire on an island? Yeah, so great question, Jack. So yes, that is possible. There's a couple ways to do that. So the ways that people probably generally do it today is like having some of that policy engine, like I mentioned in the Macaroons. So doing things, it's a little complex. I wouldn't say it's easy like out of the box quite yet, but doing things where you can hook into the RPC middleware and like watch the requests come through of keeping track of, like, Macaroon A, it has already requested 1,000 sats today. That's their limit. They can't withdraw another 1,000 sats until tomorrow. And so there are, in like a larger company, there's definitely ways to, if you have the ability to write that software, certainly ways to intercept that in the kind of in the access log and the access requests themselves to the APIs. But then there's also a project called VLS, which is Validating Lightning Signer, which is a concept of it kind of, it's not at the API level. It's more at the kind of keys signature level, where there's a lot of policy enforcement that can be done there, where you could even put it kind of generally from like a node level of, say you have an exchange and you want to set a limit of only like half a Bitcoin being withdrawn in a day. You can set policies inside of VLS to only allow that, that like 1,000 or half a Bitcoin in a day or something like that. So Validating Lightning Signer is essentially a project to do a lot of the security controls kind of at the key level as well, which is a very interesting way. So there's a couple ways to accomplish sort of the throttling of like withdrawals or things like that. You mentioned jamming attacks. Can you talk about how those can be mitigated? So Patrick asked, you mentioned jamming attacks. Can you talk about how those can be mitigated? So it's kind of a hot topic right now. It kind of comes and goes in the Lightning space, and that there's not honestly a great way to mitigate channel jamming attacks. The things that we have seen, some of the workarounds today are things like setting a max HTLC. So like by default, the max HTLCs that can like be pending in a channel or in flight are, I think, 483. And you can set that to be a lower value of like 50 or something. So it's just you aren't susceptible to as many sats like being kind of held in a pending state. So it kind of limits the amount of exposure you have. But at the end of the day, someone could still jam 50 HTLCs. And so there's not really a great way to mitigate that right now. There's a lot of conversations around how to do that. There's also people have been thinking about concepts of kind of HTLC bucketing, where like you could have like allow 50 HTLCs for 0 to 1,000 sats, and a HTLC that's 1,001 sats to 5,000 sats is a different bucket. And so someone would only be able to like jam a specific bucket of HTLC sizes. That at least would help in that your whole channel isn't offline. It's just kind of a part of it. So this gets really, really complicated really fast. And so there's not a great solution today. And we're just kind of riding on the altruism of the network today for people to not abuse that more widely. But there's a lot of work being done on it. So I do feel like we will have a good solution coming along. Alex asked about LNDmon on voltage. I have not run LNDmon against a voltage node yet, but I think that it's our Surge product is really where more of our focus is, which will essentially be like a replacement, I think, for LNDmon. Thank you for those links, Alex, on the AEZ information. Cool. Okay, so it looks like we have yep. Okay, so sweet. So I think that is I think I've addressed all the comments. If I haven't, I'll give you guys another minute or so. If you have any other questions, please drop them in, or anything else that I can clarify. All in all, I think that again, I'll repeat that we can sorry, I'm just reading the chat. So when Core Lightning is one of the questions. We are actively working on adding Core Lightning to the platform right now. We are hoping for Q1 of next year. There's just a huge amount of work that we're working on kind of behind the scenes at Voltage to like just increase our reliability, our methods, all of these things. And so Core Lightning is a part of that. And so hoping for Q1 next year. And I think that will be a realistic goal, and then adding more things from there. So there's a huge amount of things to come over the next year. So I can stop the shilling there. And then finally, if you have any other questions, like I mentioned, email support@voltage.cloud. Happy to answer. Also, we have a community Discord that you're all free to join, voltage.cloud/discord. Happy to answer any other questions. But other than that, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate it, and have a great day.